Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and maybe pour yourself a calming cup of chamomile tea. Or something strong enough to make you forget about the next hour and a half. Tonight, we're not tackling grand battles or dramatic political meltdowns. No, we're going a little deeper. We're getting right down into the actual dirt. Literally, we're going to talk about something so utterly mundane, so profoundly unexciting, that it should serve as the perfect historical lullaby. How medieval people cleaned their homes. And trust me, it's a lot less like a frantic, aggressive spring cleaning montage, and a lot more like a slow, resigned sigh in the face of absolute, pervasive grime. Think less sparkly window panes and more a light dusting of soot on your damp wooden table. So, let's just relax, settle in, and wade slowly through the historical muck, shall we? We have to start by adjusting our expectations, of course. When we picture a clean house today, we're thinking of things like disinfectants, vacuum cleaners, maybe a nice lemony scent wafting from the kitchen. The medieval world had none of that, and frankly, didn't really have the concept of germ theory floating around. The idea of sanitation was very much still in its infancy, and mostly, people just accepted the dirt as a basic part of life. It was just ... there, like an overly attached shadow. But that doesn't mean they never cleaned, right? Of course, they did. Just with tools and methods that we would find both horrifying and frankly exhausting. Let's begin with the floor, because that's the easiest and arguably the grimiest place to start. For the vast majority of people, the peasants, the artisans, the lower gentry, the floor was usually just packed earth. It was dirt. You were living on dirt. And when it rained, it was damp dirt. When it was dry, it was dusty dirt. And when you spilled ale, it was sticky, ale-soaked dirt. It's hard to clean something that is fundamentally, structurally dirt. But for those who could afford it, say, a manor house or a moderately successful merchant's home, they had floors made of stone or wood. And this is where the famous sore, infamous straw and rushes come in. You've probably heard about this, but it's worth dwelling on the sheer misery of it. Instead of cleaning the floor surface itself, they covered it up. They laid down thick, often beautifully smelling, layers of rushes, straw, or sweet-smelling herbs like mint or meadowsweet. This wasn't a carpet. This was a giant, organic, biodegradable catch-all. Now, the initial purpose was good, of course. It provided a soft, insulating layer against a freezing stone floor. It gave off a nice scent, which was a huge bonus when you consider the state of medieval plumbing. It also absorbed spilled things, like food scraps and dropped bones, and the occasional bodily fluid, because, well, the dog was in the house, and sometimes so was the pig. The cleaning of this rush-strewn floor was an exercise in pure historical procrastination. They wouldn't remove all the rushes. Oh no. That would be too much work. They would simply sweep the top layer of the rushes, remove the largest, most obviously disgusting pieces, the bones, the really obvious spills in. Then, they would simply lay a new layer of fresh rushes on top. Because why clean the old mess when you can just bury it, right? The medieval version of tossing a pile of laundry in the closet when unexpected guests arrive. Over time, this process created a thick, multi-layered historical lasagna of organic decay. The bottom layer, underneath all the subsequent layers of fresh straw, would become compressed, damp, and frankly, putrid. It was a thriving ecosystem for fleas, lice, and all sorts of delightful little critters. Think of it as a low-grade, indoor compost heap, but with more gravy stains. The rushes would sometimes only be changed out entirely once or twice a year. Think about that for a second. An entire year of spills, animal waste, mud tracked in from the street, and general historical grunge, all mashed into a damp, semi-rotting layer underfoot. It must have smelled ... just glorious. It's actually mentioned by the famous Renaissance philosopher Erasmus, who visited England in the early 16th century, and he complained bitterly about the state of English rushes. He said that the bottom layers were simply left in place, sometimes for 20 years, and that they harbored spitting, vomiting, the remains of beer and fish, and other filth unmentionable. That's a Renaissance intellectual telling you your floor is disgusting, so you know it was bad. The act of cleaning the floor, therefore, was really more of an archaeological excavation that happened maybe every 6 months. You'd have servants with pitchforks inside the house, scraping off the entire disgusting composite layer, wheelbarrowing it out to be used for garden fertilizer. Because why waste perfectly fertilized grime? And then laying down a beautiful, glorious, fresh set of rushes. For a few days, the house would be lovely. Then the cycle would begin anew. So, for the floor, the method wasn't really cleaning. It was concealing and composting. That's medieval efficiency for you. Let's move our attention up from the floor to the walls and the ceilings. Now, in a high-end royal palace, the walls might be tapestried or covered in finely carved wood. In a normal home, they were often just timber, wattle, and daub, or stone. Here, the main culprit wasn't muddy feet, but soot. Medieval homes were, for the most part, heated and cooked in by open fires. In the earliest medieval period, there were often no chimneys, just a simple hole in the roof called a louvre. The smoke from the fire had to slowly drift its way up and out. This means that everything inside the house was constantly being coated in a thin, greasy layer of soot. It wasn't a sudden, alarming blackening, but a slow, pervasive darkening of every single surface. The walls would turn a delightful, historical shade of charcoal gray. The ceiling beams would be coated in a sticky, black residue composed of wood smoke and cooking grease. This, by the way, was actually great for preserving the wood. Smoke acts as a natural insecticide and antifungal agent. So while the house looked a bit like a perpetual BBQ pit, it did discourage woodworm. Hooray for structural integrity. Now, how do you clean a ceiling covered in smoke residue? The answer is, you mostly didn't. Cleaning walls and ceilings was an absolutely immense, back-breaking chore. And it was mostly reserved for massive, seasonal cleanings, or for preparing a house for a very important guest, say, a royal visit, which rarely happened. If they did clean the walls, they would use a variety of scrubbing brushes, maybe made of stiff bristles or bundles of twigs. The cleaning agent of choice. Water, of course, which often just smeared the soot around, or a mixture of water and wood ash, which contained lye and was an effective, if highly corrosive, soap substitute. They might also use things like bread dough pressed against the walls to absorb the grease and grime. Because in the medieval world, bread was a multi-purpose tool, food, plate, and sponge. The tapestries in wealthy homes were a particular nightmare. They were beautiful, but they were also giant, expensive, decorative dust collectors. They couldn't be easily washed. You couldn't toss a huge, hand-woven tapestry into the river. So, the cleaning technique for tapestries was usually beating. Servants would take the tapestry outside, hang it up, and beat the absolute living daylights out of it with sticks or flat wooden paddles to knock out the accumulated dust, soot, and perhaps a few centuries of deeply embedded history. It was less cleaning and more an act of ritualistic aggression against dirt. And all of this had to be done on rickety ladders, by candlelight or daylight filtering through tiny windows, in a house that still smelled like old straw and smoke. It makes your modern spring cleaning look like a delightful spa day. Now that we've talked about floors and walls, let's get down to the more personal side of medieval mess: dishes and laundry. When it comes to tableware, what you used and how you cleaned it depended entirely on your social status. For the average person, dishes were often made of wood, called treenware, or a cheap type of pottery called earthenware. After a meal, they were usually just wiped down with a cloth, or maybe scraped with a knife and rinsed with a bit of water if you were feeling particularly thorough. Remember, there was no hot running water, so every drop was carried from a well or river. A fascinating thing many people used instead of plates were trenchers. These were thick slices of stale bread. You'd pile your stew or meat onto this edible plate, and the bread would soak up all the juices. After you finished your meal, You could either eat your trencher, or, if you were feeling generous, you'd give it to the poor, or toss it to the dogs. Cleaning up was as simple as eating your plate. Brilliant, right? For the wealthy, things were a bit fancier. They had pewter, silver, or even gold plates and goblets. These couldn't just be wiped. They were often scoured, clean, using sand or fine abrasive powders to remove tarnish and food residue. Then they were polished to a shine with soft cloths. This was a job for servants, of course, and keeping the master's silver gleaming was a sign of a well-run household. And then there's the laundry. This was a monumental task. You couldn't just throw a load in the washer on a Tuesday night. Washing day, or bucking day, happened maybe once a month, or even less frequently. The process was brutal. First, the clothes were soaked in a large tub. The soap they used was often a harsh mixture of lye made from wood ash, and sometimes stale urine, which contains ammonia and is a surprisingly effective cleaning agent. Yes, you heard that right. They washed their clothes in urine. After soaking, the clothes were beaten. They would be laid out on a flat stone or board and pounded with a wooden paddle called a dolly or a beetle to force the dirt out. It was a physically demanding, aggressive process. Then the clothes were rinsed, usually in a nearby river or stream, and laid out on bushes or grass to dry and be bleached by the sun. For a noble household, the sheer volume of linen tablecloths, napkins, bedsheets, and personal undergarments was immense. The entire process could take several days and involve a whole team of laundresses. It really puts complaining about folding your laundry into perspective, doesn't it? So, there you have it. A quick tour through the grimy reality of medieval housekeeping. It was a world where cleaning was less about sterile hygiene and more about a constant, ongoing battle against the overwhelming forces of dirt, soot, and general decay. It was about concealing messes, recycling filth, and putting in back-breaking labor just to achieve a level of cleanliness we would probably find unacceptable today. The next time you spray a cleaning product or turn on your vacuum, maybe take a moment to appreciate the centuries of innovation that separate you from a floor made of 20-year-old rotting straw. Thanks for sticking with me through the historical muck. If you enjoy this dive into the dirt, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more, and maybe leave a comment about what part of medieval life you'd like us to explore next. See you in the next video.
Part 2, The Scrape and the Lie, Cleaning the Utensils of the Day. Alright, let's drift gently into the next segment of our sleepy historical sanitation tour. We've covered the floors and the general ambience of soot and stale straw. Now, let's tackle the areas that interact most closely with the body, namely, the dishes and the laundry. Prepare yourself, because we are still firmly in the territory of mildly disgusting but historically interesting. Let's begin in the kitchen, or whatever area served as the cooking and dining space. Medieval tableware varied hugely depending on social status, of course. The poor and the very common folk often ate directly off thick slices of stale bread called trenchers. These were the original biodegradable plates. You piled your food on top, the bread soaked up the gravy and juices, and then, here's the sanitary part, you either ate the gravy-soaked bread, or you gave it to the dogs, or you gave it to the poor. The plate itself was disposed of every day. No washing required. Extremely practical, though maybe a little soggy. For those slightly higher up the social ladder, things got a bit more permanent, and thus, required cleaning. We're talking wooden bowls, wooden spoons, and eventually, pewter or metal cups and platters, especially for the elites. Now, imagine washing dishes without hot, running water on demand, and without commercial dish soap. It's a lot of elbow grease and a lot of scraping. The first step in medieval dish cleaning was scraping. All leftover food remnants had to be physically scraped off the wooden, pewter, or clay surfaces. Spoons and knives were the tools of choice here, often used in a slightly violent manner to ensure all chunks were removed. Then came the actual washing. This usually happened in a large, often cold, tub or basin of water. And that water was precious, so it was almost always a multi-use situation. The same water might be used for washing hands, washing vegetables, and then, finally, washing dishes. This, naturally, meant the water quickly became a cloudy, lukewarm soup of food particles and general grime. Not exactly a sterilizing environment. The washing agent was, again, wood ash lye. They would mix the wood ash, the residue from the cooking fire, with water to create a mild, soapy, alkaline solution. This was effective for cutting grease, but it was harsh on the hands and certainly didn't leave a sparkling, streak-free finish. Sometimes they might use fuller's earth or sand as a gentle abrasive to scour off stubborn, cooked-on messes. But here is the key difference from today. Washing was primarily about appearance and removing visible residue, not sterilization. The dishes would be scraped, dunked, maybe scrubbed a bit with a bundle of straw or coarse cloth, and then left to air dry. They might still harbor a lot of unseen things, but they looked clean enough. The concept of boiling or sterilizing utensils to kill invisible things simply wasn't part of the routine. You hoped the next hot meal would take care of any lingering issues. A kind of culinary Russian roulette, if you think about it. Let's now move from the culinary grime to the personal grime, laundry. This chore was absolutely backbreaking, time-consuming, and almost universally disliked, for good reason. Again, start with the clothes themselves. People didn't own vast wardrobes. Most people had 2 or 3 outfits at most. Outer garments, the wool tunics, the heavy cloaks, were almost never washed. They were brushed, beaten, and spot-cleaned. Washing wool too often ruins it, and frankly, the medieval cleaning process was so brutal, you risked destroying the garment entirely. Plus, who had the time? It was the linen undergarments, the shirts, smocks, shifts, that were washed regularly, maybe weekly or bi-weekly, because these were worn against the skin and absorbed all the sweat and body oils. Laundry day wasn't a quick 45-minute cycle in the basement. It was an all-day, highly social and physically punishing event, often taking place down by a river or a stream. The first step was soaking. The dirty linen was soaked in cold water, often overnight, to loosen the grime. Then came the lye bath. Just like the dishes, the washing powder of the medieval world was lye, usually created by dripping water through a layer of wood ash, often collected in a perforated tub or a wooden frame. This created a strong, basic solution. The linen would be boiled or steeped in this hot lye solution, a process called bucking. Bucking was effective, but it was also highly corrosive and could be dangerous if the lye solution was too strong. After the bucking came the true physical labor, beating and rinsing. The women, because this was almost universally women's work, would carry the heavy, sodden, lye-soaked clothes down to the nearest body of moving water. There, they would lay the laundry on a flat rock or a log and absolutely beat it with a dolly stick or a flat paddle. This was to physically force the dirt and the lye solution out of the fibers. Think of it as a manual washing machine, powered by pure frustration. After the beating, came the endless rinsing in the cold river or stream water, ensuring all the harsh lye was removed. Then the clothes had to be carried back, hung up, and dried. It was a cycle of soaking, boiling, carrying, beating, rinsing, and carrying again. The clean clothes smelled faintly of wood smoke and fresh air, but they were often stiff and not exactly fluffy. It was a chore so demanding that it's no wonder people were constantly wearing slightly soiled garments. They simply didn't have the energy to do it every day. Finally, let's briefly touch upon the most sensitive and most necessary topic of medieval sanitation: human waste. How did they clean up after themselves? Again, we have to divide the population. For the vast majority living in simple homes, the toilet was either a chamber pot under the bed or a communal cesspit or privy located outside. The chamber pot was simply emptied, usually into the garden, in the country, or, horrifyingly, often right into the street, in the dense, urban environment. The pots themselves were usually ceramic or metal and were simply rinsed with water after emptying, maybe with a quick scrub of sand or straw. The cleaning was functional, not antiseptic. In castles and large manor houses, things were slightly more structurally interesting, though not necessarily cleaner. They had garderobes, a fancy word for a latrine chute. These were little rooms with a hole in the floor or a seat over a shaft that led straight down. In a castle, it would often empty into the moat, the original septic tank, or a pit at the base of the wall. The name garderobe actually comes from the French words meaning to guard the robes, because the ammonia rising from the cesspit below was believed to repel moths and fleas, meaning people often stored their clothes there. An aromatic wardrobe, shall we say. The cleaning of the garderobe pit itself was the worst job in the medieval world, the job of the gong farmer or gong firmer. These poor souls were licensed, often at night, to enter the pits and haul out the accumulated waste, the gong, by hand. The waste was then taken outside the city walls. This was a necessary service, but the sheer filth and the risk of asphyxiation from the methane meant they earned a decent wage, but likely had a very short, very smelly career. So, when we talk about cleaning up waste, we're talking about manual removal and dilution. Whether it was dumped in the street for the rain to eventually carry away, or hauled out of a cesspit by a gong farmer, the underlying principle was simply to move the mess away from the immediate living area. Out of sight, out of mind, even if out of sight meant right outside the next-door neighbor's window. We've covered a good amount of historical muck now. We've scraped the dishes, beaten the laundry, and acknowledged the heroic gong farmer. Next, we really must talk about the one pervasive, structural problem that made everything else so much worse: pests. Part 3. The unwanted guests, fleas, furs, and the art of not smelling great. Let's take a deep, calming breath and settle into the most pervasive and structural issue that defeated every medieval cleaning effort: the sheer, overwhelming presence of pests. We're talking about an ecosystem thriving right inside the walls, under the rushes, and, most intimately, right on the people themselves. If dirt was the constant background noise of medieval life, then the scratching, buzzing, and scurrying of vermin was the ever-present soundtrack. The insect life, fleas and lice. Let's start small, with the insects that were utterly unavoidable: fleas and lice. These tiny, unwelcome guests weren't just a minor annoyance. They were a basic, expected part of existence, regardless of social class. Even kings and queens had them. They simply had better tailors and more clean linen, meaning the pests had to work a little harder to establish residence. The rush-strewn floors we talked about in Part 1? They were flea palaces. The straw, damp and warm from the body heat of people and animals, provided the perfect, cozy breeding ground. And because domestic animals, dogs, cats, even sometimes chickens, shared the living space, the fleas had an endless supply chain of hosts. The main method of dealing with fleas was, predictably, not very effective: shaking, beating, and brushing. To clean a bed, for instance, you would strip the bedding, take it outside, and beat it vigorously to shake out the fleas and their eggs. The mattresses themselves were often straw or feather-filled and could not be washed. They were merely aired out, hopefully on a sunny day, with the sun's heat serving as the only true disinfectant. Sometimes, people would use bunches of aromatic herbs, like lavender or pennyroyal, to try and repel the insects. They'd tuck these bunches into the rushes, hang them near the beds, or wear them in their clothes. It was a nice thought, but it was mostly just a way to add a slightly minty scent to the chaos. Lice were even more personal. Head lice and body lice were endemic, and the solution was manual delousing. This was a communal, often tedious chore. People would sit and pick the lice and nits eggs out of each other's hair or clothing seams. It was an intimate, necessary, and constant task. If the infestation was severe, the hair might be shaved, though this was usually a last resort. For clothing, special combs, or simply running the garment over a hot fire were common, brutal methods of killing the bugs. And here's a slightly snarky historical detail: furs. Wealthy people wore beautiful, expensive furs, which were status symbols. But furs are also giant, warm, luxurious hotels for fleas. There are records and illustrations showing small, elegant, carved wooden or ivory objects called flea traps or flea sticks. The lady would hold this stick near her skin, and supposedly, the fleas would prefer the nice warm stick and crawl onto it, where she could then flick them off. Was it effective? Probably not. Was it a beautiful sign of wealth and utter resignation to the presence of pests? Absolutely. The big vermin, rats and mice. Then there are the rats and mice. These weren't just a problem, they were a crisis. Medieval towns were essentially giant piles of easily accessible organic waste, and storage of grain and food was poor. This created a perfect, 5-star dining experience for rodents. Rats and mice not only ate the food supply and chewed through structures, they were, of course, the primary carriers of the flea that hosted the bubonic plague. They were a mortal threat, not just a nuisance. How did they clean them out? Well, first and foremost, cats. The cat was the medieval world's most essential piece of cleaning and sanitation technology. A good Mauser was a highly prized possession. Farmers, monasteries, and townspeople all relied on cats to keep the rodent population somewhat manageable. Dogs, too, were useful ratters, particularly certain small, energetic breeds. When cats failed, they used simple, brutal methods: traps, snares, cages, pits, and, of course, poison. Poisons were often mixtures of arsenic or other toxic compounds mixed with bait, which was effective but also highly dangerous to the household's children and pets. Cleaning up after the rats meant sealing holes, removing their nests, often found in the rushes or thatched roofs, and chasing them out of the food storage areas. It was a constant war, and in a medieval environment, the rats usually held the upper hand. Personal cleanliness, the body and the bath. Let's shift from the house to the person and address the final piece of the cleaning puzzle: personal hygiene. Because no matter how clean the rushes were on any given Tuesday, if the person walking on them was fundamentally unclean, the whole effort was moot. There is a huge, persistent myth that medieval people never bathed. This is not true. They did bathe, often more than you might think, especially in the early and high medieval periods. However, their idea of why and how to bathe was different. Bathing in the early Middle Ages, public baths, which were a holdover from the Romans, were still fairly common and popular in the early medieval period. They were social institutions where people met, bathed in large wooden tubs, and even ate and drank. Monasteries often had baths. However, these were often viewed with suspicion by the church later on, as they could lead to, shall we say, indecorous behavior. Bathing in the later Middle Ages, as the fear of disease grew, and perhaps the reality of bathhouses being rather unsanitary places where water was not changed frequently, public bathing declined. By the late Middle Ages, bathing became less frequent for most people, perhaps once a month or seasonally. When they did bathe, it was usually in a large wooden tub, often indoors, near the fire for warmth. Filling and heating the water was an immense effort, requiring dozens of trips to the well and hours of fire stoking. Because of the sheer labor involved, the entire household, from the patriarch down to the servants, often bathed in the same water, starting with the master of the house and moving down the social ladder. Efficiency, folks. The daily routine. So, if full-body baths were infrequent, what about daily cleaning? This was centered on two things: hands and face. Hand washing, particularly before and after meals, was a well-established custom, often using scented water and basins, especially for the nobility. This was primarily a social ritual, showing that one was neat enough to eat, but it had the beneficial side effect of being sanitary. For the rest of the body, people relied on rubbing and wiping with linen cloths and dry herbs. They also used perfumes and pomanders, small, decorative containers holding fragrant herbs, to mask the body odor that was simply accepted as a consequence of life. Hair and teeth. Hair was a major issue. Wealthy men and women often covered their hair with hats, veils, or wigs to keep the dust and soot out. Washing hair was rare and difficult, often involving strong lye soaps that could dry out the scalp. The main cleaning method was brushing and combing to remove debris, and, as we mentioned, manual delousing. Teeth were often cleaned using abrasive materials like finely ground salt, chalk, or burnt herbs, applied with a rough linen rag. The goal was to remove visible stains and food rather than prevent decay. Unsurprisingly, dental problems were rampant. So, the medieval person wasn't necessarily anti-clean. They were simply fighting a losing battle against pervasive dirt, limited technology, back-breaking labor requirements, and an infinite supply of pests. Their definition of clean was simply not visibly putrefying. We've covered the grime, the dishes, the pests, and the people. Next, let's wrap up this history of historical dirt by looking at the specific tools they used, and the one day of the year they actually tried to get things genuinely clean: spring cleaning. For the rest of the body, people relied on rubbing and wiping with linen cloths and dry herbs. They also used perfumes and pomanders, small, decorative containers holding fragrant herbs, to mask the body odor that was simply accepted as a consequence of life. Hair and teeth. Hair was a major issue. Wealthy men and women often covered their hair with hats, veils, or wigs to keep the dust and soot out. Washing hair was rare and difficult, often involving strong lye soaps that could dry out the scalp. The main cleaning method was brushing and combing to remove debris, and, as we mentioned, manual delousing. Teeth were often cleaned using abrasive materials like finely ground salt, chalk, or burnt herbs, applied with a rough linen rag. The goal was to remove visible stains and food rather than prevent decay. Unsurprisingly, dental problems were rampant. So, the medieval person wasn't necessarily anti-clean. They were simply fighting a losing battle against pervasive dirt, limited technology, back-breaking labor requirements, and an infinite supply of pests. Their definition of clean was simply not visibly putrefying. We've covered the grime, the dishes, the pests, and the people. Next, let's wrap up this history of historical dirt by looking at the specific tools they used, and the one day of the year they actually tried to get things genuinely clean: spring cleaning. Part 4. The tools of the scrape, brooms, buckets, and the big annual sweep. Let's keep that gentle, monotonous history train rolling right into the specifics of how they did the cleaning. We've established the dirt was pervasive, the water was finite, and the pests were numerous. Now, let's look at the basic technology of grime removal, the tools of the medieval trade. If you're imagining a sleek array of modern cleaning gadgets, adjust your brain back a few hundred years. Medieval cleaning was defined by simplicity, brutality, and whatever raw materials were handy. The toolkit, simple, hard, and handmade. The broom was, naturally, the absolute superstar of the medieval cleaning cabinet. The birch broom. Forget the neat, tidy synthetic bristles of today. The most common broom was the besom, made from bundles of twigs, usually birch or heather, tied tightly around a wooden pole. It was rustic, effective for sweeping up large debris and straw, and required constant replacement because the twigs broke easily. Sweeping with a besom was less about dusting and more about shoving things out of the way. The pitchfork and rake. Yes, we mentioned these before, but it bears repeating. Agricultural tools were household tools. The pitchfork was the device of choice for the massive, semi-annual task of removing the old, compacted layers of rushes and manure from the floor. A rake might be used for scattering fresh rushes evenly. This blending of the farmyard and the living room is a subtle, yet profound, reminder of how intimately connected life was to the land. The next essential item was the bucket and the basin. Buckets, made of wood staves bound with iron hoops, like a small barrel, or sometimes leather, these were heavy and cumbersome when filled. They were used for hauling water from the well, the stream, or the cistern. Cleaning often involved multiple, weary trips hauling these heavy buckets, meaning water conservation wasn't just economical, it was necessary for survival. Scrubbing materials. Brushes were typically made from stiff animal hair, like hog bristle, or tough plant fibers. For serious scouring, they relied on natural abrasives, sand, gravel, or scouring rush. Scouring rush is a plant, Equisetum hyemale, which has silica deposits in its stems, making it naturally abrasive, a botanical scouring pad. They would use this to scrub pots, pans, and perhaps the wooden table surfaces. They simply had to rely on friction and physical effort to dislodge the dirt. And, of course, the knife and the trenchers. The knife was always close at hand, used not just for cutting food, but for scraping dried messes off surfaces, the ultimate blunt cleaning tool. When you put all this together, you get a cleaning routine that is slow, heavy, wet, and manual. It was a constant struggle where brute force was preferred over chemical wizardry. The big event, spring cleaning, medieval edition. Given the general state of low-level grime, a proper, thorough cleaning was usually saved for the one major ritualistic cleaning event of the year, spring cleaning. This tradition, which we still, reluctantly, observe today, has deep medieval and even older roots. It wasn't just about feeling good about a clean house, it was driven by necessity and tradition. 1. The necessity. Winter was the worst time for dirt. Windows were sealed up to keep the cold out, fires burned almost constantly, depositing a huge layer of soot and ash, and people were often living indoors with their animals, sometimes small livestock, for long periods. By the time spring rolled around, the house was at peak filth, dark, damp, smoky, and insect-ridden. 2. The timing. The transition to spring meant warmer, sunnier weather, which was crucial. Suddenly, you could open windows and doors without freezing, allowing for ventilation, getting rid of the stale, smoky air, and allowing things to actually dry. 3. The ritual. The entire household would engage in this massive, multi-day undertaking. Floor evacuation. The single most satisfying and most laborious step was the total removal of the old, accumulated layer of rushes. Pitchforks would scrape the organic muck down to the stone or earth floor. This layer, sometimes inches thick, was carted out, symbolizing the literal sweeping away of the old year's decay. Airing and beating, everything washable or portable was taken outside. Bedding was hung up. Tapestries were beaten, as discussed in Part 3. Wooden furniture was wiped down with lye or vinegar and left to air dry in the sun, which, again, provided the only real form of disinfection they had access to. Whitewashing. For those who could afford it, the walls might be whitewashed. This involved applying a thin coat of slaked lime, calcium hydroxide, to the interior walls. The whitewash had several benefits. It brightened the room immensely, reflecting more light. It sealed up minor cracks where pests might lurk, and, crucially, the lime had mild antiseptic and insect repellent properties. It was the medieval equivalent of a deep cleaning, high-gloss paint job. The new start. Finally, the house was replenished. New rushes were laid down, providing a delightful fresh scent and a soft, clean underfoot feeling. Fresh herbs were brought in, and the house felt structurally renewed, at least until the next major winter mess began to accumulate. So, while the daily cleaning was really just a low-effort maintenance and sweeping, the annual spring clean was a genuine, structural effort at purification. It was an acknowledgement that dirt was a constant enemy that required a massive, ritualistic show of force to keep at bay. And with that, we've thoroughly examined the physical battle against medieval dirt, from the tools of the trade to the biggest cleaning party of the year. I think we need to shift gears slightly and talk about the ultimate purifiers, fire and water, and the people who decided they didn't need to clean at all. Part 5. Water, fire, and the aristocratic stench, the deliberately unwashed. Alright, we're settling into the deep end of historical cleaning now. We've established that medieval people were messy, but they tried, bless their hearts. Now, let's consider the two most powerful, if inconsistent, purifying forces available to them, fire and water, and then float over to a fascinating historical contradiction: the people who were wealthy enough to clean, but chose not to. The purifying powers, fire and water. In a world lacking commercial disinfectants, Medieval sanitation often relied on the sheer, brute force of the elements. Fire. The concept of using heat to purify was intuitive. People knew that fire could kill pests, sanitize surfaces, and, of course, cook food safely. Pest control, as we discussed, clothing could be passed quickly over a flame to scorch out lice and nits. This was a common, if slightly risky, method of personal pest management. Burning the bedding, or even occasionally burning the old, dirty rushes in the garden, was a way to reset the environment completely. Boiling water was crucial for laundry, the bucking process we mentioned. The sustained heat of boiling water and lye was the most effective method they had for cleaning and sanitizing linen. It wasn't understood as germ-killing, but as a way to dislodge the deep-seated organic material. Ash and lye, the byproduct of fire, wood ash, was the engine of medieval cleaning. It provided the lye for soap, which was a naturally powerful degreaser and disinfectant. In this sense, the cooking fire was also the central hub of the cleaning process. Droplet water. Water was, obviously, essential, but its very abundance or scarcity dictated the state of cleanliness. Running water versus standing water. Medieval people understood that running water, rivers, streams, fast-flowing channels, was generally cleaner and healthier than standing water, stagnant ponds, or cesspits. This is why washing and laundry often took place by a stream. Flushing. Water was the primary agent for moving waste. Whether it was the rain washing filth out of the street gutters, an imperfect system, to be sure, or water being deliberately poured down a garderobe chute, the solution to human waste was usually to dilute it and send it elsewhere. The problem of wells. However, water was also the major vector for disease. If a well was contaminated by a nearby cesspit, a shockingly common occurrence in dense urban areas, the same water used for drinking, cooking, and washing was actively spreading disease. This irony, that the thing needed for cleaning was also the primary source of sickness, is a deeply tragic theme of medieval urban life. Their lack of understanding regarding groundwater contamination meant that every refreshing sip of water was a potential gamble. The constant, low-level effort of cleaning was largely an effort to keep these two elements, fire and water, working in their favor without letting them become destructive. When filth became fashion, the unwashed aristocracy. Now for the fun part, the elite. The people who absolutely could afford unlimited fresh water, endless clean linen, the sweetest scented herbs, and even a team of servants to beat their rugs daily. And yet, some of the worst periods of cleanliness occurred among the highest classes, particularly in the later medieval and early modern periods. Because of a bizarre, and ultimately catastrophic, shift in medical belief. Around the 16th and 17th centuries, the rise of Galenic medical theory, combined with the catastrophic outbreaks of the Black Death and syphilis, led to a pervasive, paranoid fear of water and air. The theory went like this: disease enters the body through the pores. Therefore, if you take a hot bath, the heat opens your pores, and the bathwater, which might not be clean and might carry invisible miasma, bad air, will seep into your body and kill you. The logical conclusion? Stop bathing entirely. This led to centuries of European royalty and aristocracy proudly and deliberately embracing a state of personal filth. Louis XIV, the Sun King, a prime example. The great king of France, who lived in the magnificent palace of Versailles, famously took only a handful of baths in his entire adult life. Some records say 2 or 3. And these were usually prescribed by a doctor, less for hygiene and more for medicinal purposes. Of course, he was surrounded by thousands of courtiers, all of whom were also trying not to bathe. The solution is masking. Since they weren't bathing, body odor was an understandable problem. Their solution was perfume. The wealthy aristocracy became obsessed with heavy, musk-based perfumes, fragrant powders, and elaborate sachets of dried herbs tucked into their clothing. The goal was not to remove the odor, but to chemically overwhelm and confuse the senses. It was a scented war on basic sanitation. The linen lifeline, the main cleaning mechanism for the person, was no longer water, but linen. They believed that the fine linen of the shift or shirt, worn directly against the skin, would absorb the sweat, oil, and filth. They would change their linen shirt daily, or multiple times a day if they were very rich. The dirty linen was then boiled and scrubbed in lye. So, while the body was unwashed, the outer layer of clothing acted as a kind of disposable, absorbent shell, which was then cleaned aggressively. This is the great, ironic punchline of royal cleaning. The peasants living in simple huts with dirt floors were bathing more frequently, however crudely, than the royalty living in gilded palaces. The poor, resigned to basic filth, often had a better sense of water's purifying properties than the educated, paranoid elites. We've now covered the complete historical spectrum of grime management. We've scraped the dishes, chased the fleas, and sniffed the Sun King's perfume. We're done with the dirt. Part 6. The Unfortunate Inheritance, a dive into dynastic disorder. Alright, let's make a smooth, sleepy transition from the world of dirt and dish scraping into the far more engaging world of human disorder. The mess we're talking about now is less about soot and more about bad genetics, worse decisions, and general royal incompetence. We are floating over to our primary topic, the sheer, tragicomic dysfunction of historical elites, focusing on the terrible legacy of inbreeding in European monarchies. Grab your historical blanket, because this is where the historical drama gets very weird, very sad, and very quiet. We have to begin, naturally, with the poster child for dynastic genetic disaster, the Habsburgs. Specifically, the Spanish branch. The history of the Spanish Habsburgs is essentially a long, slow, 200-year case study in why you should absolutely not marry your first cousin, your aunt, or your niece. And then do it again and again and again. Because why settle for a little bit of genetic instability when you can triple down on it, right? The goal of these royal marriages was simple, of course: keep the power, land, and money within the family. The Habsburg Empire was vast. It included Spain, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, and huge tracts of the Americas. Letting that power slip into the hands of a French prince or an English royal was unthinkable. So, they decided to keep it snug and cozy right there in the Habsburg bloodline. This required a level of relentless endogamy that borders on the cartoonishly absurd. By the time the line ended, 9 out of the 11 marriages in the Spanish royal family were between immediate relatives. This wasn't just common, it was the default setting. The most famous and most tragic result of this policy was Charles II of Spain, Carlos II. He was the last of the Spanish Habsburg line, and he was known by the rather unkind nickname El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Because when your king is a physical and mental wreck, it must be the work of witches, not 4 generations of inbreeding, right? Of course. Charles II was born in 1661, and his entry into the world was complicated. His parents were Philip IV and his niece, Mariana of Austria. That's right, the queen was the king's niece. This particular pairing, combined with the generations before it, gave Charles II the equivalent of a staggering 25% inbreeding coefficient. To put that in perspective, the child of siblings has an inbreeding coefficient of 25%. Charles II's parents were uncle and niece, but the accumulated history meant he was basically as inbred as if his parents had been brother and sister. The genetic result was essentially a long, slow catalog of physical and intellectual misfortune. He couldn't speak until he was 4. He couldn't walk until he was 8. He had a massive, bulbous head and a sickly, pale constitution. He suffered from constant illnesses, fits, and fevers throughout his childhood. Most famously, he possessed the exaggerated Habsburg jaw, mandibular prognathism. His lower jaw was so large and jutting that his upper and lower teeth couldn't meet. He couldn't chew his food properly, and he drooled constantly. He was called the Handsome, ironically, by his courtiers, because he looked less like a king and more like a slowly melting historical gargoyle. A life of misery and misrule. Poor Charles II was not raised to rule. He was raised to survive. He was kept in a state of perpetually dependent, infantile pampering until he was 10 years old, partly because his mother and advisors wanted to keep control, and partly because he was so physically delicate. He was literally carried around like a baby for the first decade of his life. When he finally took the throne, he was a king in name only. He was amiable, deeply religious, and profoundly ineffective. He was incapable of making decisions, and often oscillated between bouts of manic excitement and deep, debilitating depression. He was a political vacuum, and the Spanish court became a nasty, swirling den of competing factions, nobles, and priests, all vying to control the king who couldn't control himself. And, of course, the primary, terrifying problem. He had to produce an heir. He was married twice. Both marriages were essentially feudal, agonizing political transactions designed to save the dynasty. His first wife was Marie-Louise of Orleans, a vibrant, beautiful, and intelligent French princess. She was absolutely horrified by the Spanish court, the repressive atmosphere, and, understandably, her physically repulsive, mentally challenged husband. She spent 9 years trying to conceive an heir, enduring humiliating examinations and endless quack medical treatments, but she never did. She died young and, tragically, probably from appendicitis, though naturally, everyone suspected poisoning, because drama. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, was even more desperately pressured to produce a child. The Spanish court tried everything: amulets, relics, pilgrimages, and even an exorcism performed on the king himself. Remember, he was the bewitched. But Charles II was likely sterile, a final, cruel genetic full stop to the Spanish Habsburg line. Charles II died in 1700 at the age of 38. The autopsy report was horrific, describing his body as having no blood, lungs that were corroded, a heart the size of a peppercorn, and a digestive system that was basically rotten. This wasn't a king, it was a biological accident waiting to expire. His death, heirless, plunged Europe directly into the massive, continent-consuming war of the Spanish Succession, fought over who had the right to inherit the land that Charles II had spent his life failing to govern. The entire, brutal war was the final, bloody price paid for the Habsburgs' obsessive commitment to keeping the family tree a tight little genetic knot. The story of Charles II is the ultimate cautionary tale of dynastic cleaning. They tried to clean out all foreign blood and ended up cleaning out the very viability of their lineage. Let's take a pause here, let that tragedy settle, and then we'll drift over to another family where the dysfunction was less genetic and more purely mental. Part 7. The Maltese Knight, the Paranoid Reign of Tsar Paul I. We have successfully departed the genetically fraught palaces of Madrid and are now coasting smoothly over to the frosty, chaotic court of Imperial Russia. The dysfunction here is less about compromised DNA and more about a spectacular failure of childhood, a deep-seated inferiority complex, and a paranoia that hardened into policy. We are talking about Tsar Paul I of Russia, reigned 1796 to 1801. If Charles II was tragic, Paul I was a kind of high-stakes, historical black comedy, a man who desperately wanted to be a glorious military despot but mostly just came across as an extremely stressed, tiny, perpetually angry boy who finally got his own sandbox. The shadow of Catherine the Great. Paul I's problem, and the source of his profound instability, was his mother, the formidable, intellectual, and utterly magnificent Catherine the Great. Catherine, a German princess who stole the Russian throne from her husband, Peter III, Paul's father, who was murdered shortly after, had a famously complicated relationship with her son. She pretty much decided Paul was emotionally unstable and politically incompetent from day one. So, she basically kidnapped him from his nursery and raised him away from court, assigning his education to various tutors and effectively treating him as a necessary, inconvenient heir rather than a beloved son. Paul spent his entire adult life waiting, 34 miserable years, for his mother to die and let him have his turn. He lived under the constant, suffocating fear that his mother was plotting to disinherit him in favor of his own son, Alexander. This long period of political impotence and psychological neglect warped his personality into a volatile mix of severe anxiety, quick rages, and intense rigidity. When Catherine finally died in 1796, Paul I ascended the throne, and the Russian Empire braced itself for the inevitable eccentricities. The reign of petty rules. Paul I's reign was short, only 4 years and 4 months, but it was spectacular in its arbitrary weirdness. He wasn't so much interested in running an empire as he was in imposing perfect, geometric, Prussian-style order on everything he could see. His mind was obsessed with minutiae, uniformity, and rigid military discipline, which he viewed as the solution to all of Russia's problems. Fashion police. He immediately issued a series of spectacularly petty decrees aimed at forcing the Russian nobility to behave, dress, and look the way he thought they should. He banned top hats, coattails, and certain colors of waistcoats, which he associated with French revolutionary ideas. You could be exiled to Siberia for the wrong fashion choice. He ordered everyone to bow low in the Prussian style, making sure ladies dropped into a deep curtsy and men stooped profoundly. The parade ground obsession. Paul was obsessed with the minute details of the military parade. He spent hours, every single day, personally drilling his guards, forcing them to adopt the stiff, precise, mechanical movements of the Prussian army, even though Russia was not Prussian. He cared less about military strategy and more about the exact angle of a bayonet or the precise spacing of marching columns. The life of a Russian officer became an endless, terrifying theatrical performance for the Tsar. The Maltese Knight. His weirdest obsession was with the Knights Hospitaller of Malta. He somehow convinced himself that he was the rightful Grand Master of the Catholic, monastic order of knights, despite being the Orthodox Tsar of Russia. He eventually declared himself Grand Master, started wearing the black Maltese cross, and ordered Russian officers to adopt the insignia. It was bizarre. He poured vast amounts of Russian money and effort into supporting this irrelevant, tiny island order, simply because he loved the historical pageantry and the idea of being a high-ranking European knight. The paranoid king. These eccentricities were entertaining for history, but terrifying for the people living through them. Paul's paranoia was his most destructive feature. He saw conspirators everywhere. Because he was constantly afraid of being overthrown, just like his father, Peter III, his reaction was to be cruel, unpredictable, and swift. He would suddenly, without warning or explanation, exile perfectly loyal courtiers or famous generals to remote estates or prisons. He would promote people based on fleeting whims and then demote them the next day after a bad night's sleep. He constantly moved his family from one palace to another, thinking he was avoiding assassins. He even built the incredibly fortified Mykhailovsky Castle, a grim, moat-surrounded fortress in St. Petersburg, specifically as a safe house for himself. Of course, he only lived there for 40 days. The entire court was living on a knife's edge, utterly terrified of upsetting the small, red-faced man who was convinced the world was against him. He was a tyrant, but a petty, insecure one. The predictable end. The paranoia, the petty tyranny, and the expensive obsession with the Maltese Knights finally wore out the tolerance of the Russian elite. The army officers, who hated the endless drilling, and the nobles, who hated the random exiles, decided enough was enough. In March 1801, a group of disaffected officers, led by a few powerful courtiers, slipped into the highly fortified Mykhailovsky Castle. They cornered the Tsar in his bedroom. The plan was simply to force him to abdicate. However, Tsar Paul, who was notoriously hot-tempered and resistant, got into a scuffle. In the ensuing chaos, he was either strangled with a scarf, beaten with a golden snuff-box, or simply crushed to death. The details are murky, but the outcome was final. His death was immediately announced as an apoplectic stroke, because, of course, Russia couldn't admit its Tsar had been murdered by his own officers 40 days after moving into his safe castle. His son, Alexander, who was aware of the plot but conveniently asleep during the execution, inherited the throne, and the Russian Empire breathed a collective, massive sigh of relief. Paul I's reign is a perfect, condensed example of how a combination of psychological damage and unchecked power can lead to a period of spectacular, yet deeply unhappy, historical dysfunction. Part 8. The Queen Who Couldn't Let Go, The Agony of Joanna the Mad. We are now making a quiet, reflective crossing from the chilly, paranoid chaos of the Russian court to the sun-drenched, but emotionally suffocating Kingdom of Castile, modern Spain. This time, the dysfunction is less about an inherited jawline or petty rules, and more about a spectacular, century-spanning tragedy fueled by obsessive love, political ambition, and a complete lack of mental health care. We are settling in with the incredibly unfortunate life of Joanna I of Castile, 1479 to 1555, forever known to history by the chilling epithet, Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad. A promising, brilliant youth, Joanna was born into what seemed like the historical equivalent of a perfect power couple, Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, the Catholic monarchs, who funded Columbus and united Spain. She was bright, educated, spoke multiple languages, and was deeply religious. She was destined for a high-value dynastic marriage, and in 1496, she was sent to Flanders to marry Philip the Handsome, 1478 to 1506. Now, Philip was everything a medieval prince was supposed to be: dashing, charismatic, and undeniably attractive. But he was also frivolous, wildly promiscuous, and deeply arrogant. Joanna fell spectacularly in love with him. This wasn't a polite, political affection. This was a fierce, all-consuming passion. She was instantly, totally obsessed with her husband, and this obsession became the single defining, destructive force of her entire life. Philip, on the other hand, was utterly bored by her devotion. He had married her for the rich Spanish inheritance, and he preferred the casual, non-committal company of his numerous Flemish mistresses. This created the perfect recipe for disaster: a fiercely devoted wife with a volatile emotional interior, married to a breathtakingly careless and unfaithful husband. Joanna's jealous rages were spectacular and became famous across Europe. She would physically attack her husband's mistresses and servants in fits of uncontrolled fury. The throne arrives, the mind departs. The real tragedy is that Joanna was never supposed to rule. She was third in line. But through a miserable series of historical accidents, the death of her older brother, the death of her sister, and the death of her sister's infant son, she suddenly became the undisputed heiress to the massive crowns of Castile and Aragon in 1500. She was now queen, and her handsome, ambitious husband, Philip, became King Philip I of Castile, jure uxoris, king by right of his wife. Philip wanted the power, but he didn't want the messy, jealous wife who came with it. His goal became simple: prove Joanna is unfit to rule, lock her away, and take sole control of Spain. And, tragically, Joanna made it very easy for him. The immense stress of sudden kingship, constant pregnancies. She had 6 children with Philip, including 2 future emperors and a queen, and her husband's ceaseless betrayal pushed her fragile mind past the breaking point. She developed what history retrospectively suggests was a form of psychotic depression, or possibly bipolar disorder, characterized by withdrawal, periods of frantic activity, and intense, paranoid jealousy. The historical love story gone wrong. The final, bizarre act of this doomed romance occurred in 1506. Joanna and Philip were in Spain, fighting a political battle over control of the government when Philip suddenly died, likely from typhoid fever, though Joanna immediately suspected poisoning, naturally. He was only 28. Joanna's reaction was legendary. It was a macabre, agonizing, public display of grief and attachment that secured her reputation as the Mad. The traveling corpse. She absolutely refused to let the body be buried immediately. She ordered that the ornate lead coffin be opened frequently so she could gaze upon her husband's remains. The royal road trip. She then undertook a bizarre 8-month-long royal funeral procession across Castile. She would only travel at night, believing that a cloistered nunnery's rule meant only men could see her husband's body. She insisted on sleeping near the coffin every single night. The open casket. Whenever the procession stopped, she had the coffin placed in a church, then promptly reopened it, kissing her husband's feet and refusing to let any woman, especially attractive young women, come near it. This agonizing performance, dragging a rotting royal corpse across the Spanish countryside, was not just the behavior of a grieving widow, it was political ammunition. Her father, Ferdinand, and later her son, Charles V, who became Holy Roman Emperor, used this spectacle of madness to declare her unfit to rule. A lifetime behind bars. Joanna was officially deemed incapable of governing, and in 1509 her father, Ferdinand, had her confined to the royal convent of Santa Clara at Tordesillas. And here is the truly sad part. She remained imprisoned in that convent for the next 46 years. She was never formally deposed because her right to the throne was absolute. Her father ruled as regent, and then her powerful son, Charles V, ruled as co-monarch, while Joanna lived out a twilight existence in captivity. Her madness, which was severe but perhaps manageable, was exacerbated by her isolation. She often refused to sleep in a bed, refused to change her clothes, and sometimes sat in a solitary room, clutching her husband's crucifix, convinced he would return. She died in 1555, never having truly ruled and never having truly recovered from her profound emotional damage. The life of Joanna the Mad is a melancholy reminder that in the royal game, personal feelings, especially love and grief, are weaknesses that political rivals will exploit ruthlessly. Her descent into madness wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was the mechanism used by the ambitious men around her to seize control of the largest empire in the world. Part 9. The Boy King and the Sickly Crown, Edward VI of England. Let's gently leave the tragic, passionate melodrama of Joanna the Mad behind, and drift over to a different kind of royal suffering, the quiet, painful decline of a sickly child king. We are now settling into the Tudor dynasty of England, a family famous for its robust, larger-than-life personalities, but whose reign was briefly and sadly interrupted by a small, frail boy. We are talking about Edward VI, 1537 to 1553, the son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. He was born into an environment of spectacular political and religious upheaval, inheriting a crown that was still sticky with the blood of his father's rivals. He was a king who was, essentially, designed by committee and born for consumption. The precious, pressured heir. Edward's birth was everything Henry VIII had been waiting for, a legitimate, male heir. His mother, Jane Seymour, died shortly after his birth, and Henry viewed the boy as an almost sacred object, a sign of God's blessing on his tumultuous reign. This meant Edward was raised in an environment of suffocating care and immense pressure. The bubble. He was kept largely isolated from the world to protect him from disease, which, in the 16th century, was a perfectly reasonable fear. But this isolation meant he grew up brilliant and deeply educated, yet profoundly unprepared for the political and human realities of his eventual role. The intellectual machine, Edward was incredibly intelligent. He was fluent in Latin, Greek, and French, and deeply interested in theology and history. He had a dry, precocious wit and kept a detailed journal. He was, by all accounts, a remarkably good child, pious, serious, and scholarly. The frail physique, the problem was his body. Edward was never a robust child. He was often described as frail, prone to colds, and constantly battling various minor illnesses. While Tudor portraits show him as a handsome, serious little boy, the constant shadow of sickness hung over him. Whether his frail health was genetic, perhaps inherited from his mother, Jane Seymour, who was also delicate, or simply the result of 16th-century childhood illnesses is hard to say. What we do know is that he was a beautiful piece of historical china, highly prized, but easily broken. The reign of the council. In 1547, at the age of 9, Edward became King of England upon the death of his gigantic, demanding father. Of course, a 9-year-old cannot actually run an empire, especially one that Henry VIII had just dragged through a messy, violent reformation. So, Edward's reign was run by a series of powerful protectors and councils. The real power lay in the hands of his uncle, Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, and later, John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland. Edward VI, the boy, was intensely aware of the religious aspect of his reign. He had been educated by Protestant tutors and was a fervent, hardline Protestant. He saw it as his sacred duty to complete the English Reformation, purifying the Church of its lingering Catholic elements. The zeal. This is the unsettling contrast of his reign, the political and religious violence, the destruction of monasteries, the abolition of the Latin Mass, the burning of heretics, was being carried out in the name of a serious, pious, 13-year-old boy. He was a ruthless theologian, even if he was still playing with wooden soldiers. He signed documents confirming the execution of those who opposed his religious views. The puppeteer. Though he was a keen participant in council meetings, his role was always limited. He was a symbol wielded by the ambitious men around him. The history of his reign is less about the king's governance and more about the vicious, backstabbing political infighting between his protectors, a quiet, frail child sitting on a throne while powerful, greedy men shouted over him. The end of the line. The tragedy reached its climax in 1552 to 1553. Edward contracted what was likely tuberculosis, though some historians suggest a severe, lingering case of measles or perhaps bronchial pneumonia. Whatever the cause, it became clear the young king was not going to recover. The sight of the once promising, clever boy fading away must have been deeply disturbing for the court. His cough became chronic and brutal. He suffered periods of fever and extreme weakness. His breathing became ragged. As he lay dying, the true scope of the political pressure on him became clear. He knew his older half-sister, Mary, was a devout Catholic and would instantly reverse his Protestant reforms. So, in the last act of his short, tragic life, Edward took matters into his own hands. He wrote the devise for the succession, specifically naming Lady Jane Grey, his Protestant cousin, as his heir, cutting both his Catholic sister Mary and his Protestant sister Elizabeth out of the line of succession. This was an act of political desperation and religious conviction, orchestrated by the powerful Duke of Northumberland, who, of course, promptly married his son to Lady Jane. Edward VI died in July 1553, just shy of his 16th birthday. He had reigned for 6.5 turbulent years. His death immediately plunged England into a short, sharp political crisis, the 9-day reign of Lady Jane Grey, followed by the bloody, successful coup of Mary I. The story of Edward VI is a story of promise tragically curtailed by biology. He was the golden boy, the intellectual hope, who was simply too delicate for the unforgiving political and microbial world of the 16th century. He was a sickly vessel for a massive historical force, and when the vessel broke, the resulting political explosion shattered the peace of the kingdom. Part 9. The Boy King and the Sickly Crown, Edward VI of England. Let's gently leave the tragic, passionate melodrama of Joanna the Mad behind, and drift over to a different kind of royal suffering, the quiet, painful decline of a sickly child king. We are now settling into the Tudor dynasty of England, a family famous for its robust, larger-than-life personalities, but whose reign was briefly and sadly interrupted by a small, frail boy. We are talking about Edward VI, 1537 to 1553, the son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. He was born into an environment of spectacular political and religious upheaval, inheriting a crown that was still sticky with the blood of his father's rivals. He was a king who was, essentially, designed by committee and born for consumption. The precious, pressured heir. Edward's birth was everything Henry VIII had been waiting for, a legitimate, male heir. His mother, Jane Seymour, died shortly after his birth, and Henry viewed the boy as an almost sacred object, a sign of God's blessing on his tumultuous reign. This meant Edward was raised in an environment of suffocating care and immense pressure. The bubble. He was kept largely isolated from the world to protect him from disease, which, in the 16th century, was a perfectly reasonable fear. But this isolation meant he grew up brilliant and deeply educated, yet profoundly unprepared for the political and human realities of his eventual role. The intellectual machine, Edward was incredibly intelligent. He was fluent in Latin, Greek, and French, and deeply interested in theology and history. He had a dry, precocious wit and kept a detailed journal. He was, by all accounts, a remarkably good child, pious, serious, and scholarly. The frail physique, the problem was his body. Edward was never a robust child. He was often described as frail, prone to colds, and constantly battling various minor illnesses. While Tudor portraits show him as a handsome, serious little boy, the constant shadow of sickness hung over him. Whether his frail health was genetic, perhaps inherited from his mother, Jane Seymour, who was also delicate, or simply the result of 16th-century childhood illnesses is hard to say. What we do know is that he was a beautiful piece of historical china, highly prized, but easily broken. The reign of the Council. In 1547, at the age of 9, Edward became King of England upon the death of his gigantic, demanding father. Of course, a 9-year-old cannot actually run an empire, especially one that Henry VIII had just dragged through a messy, violent reformation. So, Edward's reign was run by a series of powerful protectors and councils. The real power lay in the hands of his uncle, Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, and later, John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland. Edward VI, the boy, was intensely aware of the religious aspect of his reign. He had been educated by Protestant tutors and was a fervent, hardline Protestant. He saw it as his sacred duty to complete the English Reformation, purifying the Church of its lingering Catholic elements. The zeal, this is the unsettling contrast of his reign, the political and religious violence, the destruction of monasteries, the abolition of the Latin Mass, the burning of heretics, was being carried out in the name of a serious, pious, 13-year-old boy. He was a ruthless theologian, even if he was still playing with wooden soldiers. He signed documents confirming the execution of those who opposed his religious views. The puppeteer, though he was a keen participant in council meetings, his role was always limited. He was a symbol wielded by the ambitious men around him. The history of his reign is less about the king's governance and more about the vicious, backstabbing political infighting between his protectors, a quiet, frail child sitting on a throne while powerful, greedy men shouted over him. The end of the line. The tragedy reached its climax in 1552 to 1553. Edward contracted what was likely tuberculosis, though some historians suggest a severe, lingering case of measles or perhaps bronchial pneumonia. Whatever the cause, it became clear the young king was not going to recover. The sight of the once promising, clever boy fading away must have been deeply disturbing for the court. His cough became chronic and brutal. He suffered periods of fever and extreme weakness. His breathing became ragged. As he lay dying, the true scope of the political pressure on him became clear. He knew his older half-sister, Mary, was a devout Catholic and would instantly reverse his Protestant reforms. So, in the last act of his short, tragic life, Edward took matters into his own hands. He wrote the devise for the succession, specifically naming Lady Jane Grey, his Protestant cousin, as his heir, cutting both his Catholic sister Mary and his Protestant sister Elizabeth out of the line of succession. This was an act of political desperation and religious conviction, orchestrated by the powerful Duke of Northumberland, who, of course, promptly married his son to Lady Jane. Edward VI died in July 1553, just shy of his 16th birthday. He had reigned for 6.5 turbulent years. His death immediately plunged England into a short, sharp political crisis, the 9-day reign of Lady Jane Grey, followed by the bloody, successful coup of Mary I. The story of Edward VI is a story of promise tragically curtailed by biology. He was the golden boy, the intellectual hope, who was simply too delicate for the unforgiving political and microbial world of the 16th century. He was a sickly vessel for a massive historical force, and when the vessel broke, the resulting political explosion shattered the peace of the kingdom. Whether his frail health was genetic, perhaps inherited from his mother, Jane Seymour, who was also delicate, or simply the result of 16th-century childhood illnesses is hard to say. Then came the medical episodes that defined the latter half of his life and earned him the tragic moniker of Mad King George. The reign of the council, major, public episode occurred in 1789. Edward became king of England upon the death of his gigantic, demanding father. Of course, a 9-year-old cannot actually run an empire, especially one that Henry VIII had just dragged through a messy, violent reformation. And excruciating, so temporary reign was run by a series of powerful protectors and councils. These were far worse. The real power lay in the hands of his uncle, Edward Seymour, manic delirium. The Duke of Somerset. He would talk for hours without John Dudley, foaming at the mouth. Northumberland. He would write letters to inanimate objects. The boy was intensely aware of the religious aspect of his reign. He would engage in sexually inappropriate behavior. Tutors and was a fervent, confusion and total amnesia. He saw it as his sacred duty to complete the English Reformation, lacking any understanding of mental illness. They settled on the prevailing theory: the zeal, too much stress, the unsettling contrast of his reign, bad humors, the political and religious violence. Their cures, the destruction of monasteries, involving the abolition of the doses of purgatives, the burning of heretics, blistering the skin, carried out in the name of a serious physical restraint in a straitjacket or being tied to a chair. He was a ruthless theologian. The treatment was medieval, even if he was still playing with wooden soldiers. Distress and delirium documents confirming the execution of those who opposed his religious views. Great medical mysteries. Though he was a keen participant in council meetings, his role was always limited. Suggested he suffered from porphyria, by the ambitious genetic blood disorder that can cause all of his physical and neurological symptoms, and more about the vicious, neat, backstabbing political infighting between his protectors. However, a quiet, more recent scientific analysis of his hair samples suggests that the porphyria theory might be an oversimplification. The tragedy reached its climax and medical experts now argue that his symptoms, particularly the severe mental deterioration later in life, are more consistent with bipolar disorder, the mania and case of measles, combined with a bronchial pneumonia. Neurodegenerative Whatever disease, the cause, perhaps it became clear the young king was not going to recover. Episodes of delirium. The sight of the once promising, clouded by centuries of bad medicine and incomplete records for the court. The long, isolated twilight and brutal. The worst and final periods began in 1810 and extreme weakness. Following the death of his youngest daughter, Princess Amelia, as he lay dying, George the true scope of the political pressure on him became clear. This time, there was no recovery. Mary, for the last decade of his reign, he was effectively confined to the lonely, lavish apartments of Windsor Castle. Of his short, tragic life, Edward took matters into his own hands. Prince of Wales, he wrote the devise for the succession, was specifically naming Lady Jane Grey, ruling in his father's cousin, as George III, cutting both his Catholic sister Mary and his increasingly sister Elizabeth out of the line prisoner of his own mind. This was an act of political desperation and religious conviction, orchestrated by the powerful Duke of Northumberland, who, of course, speaking to imaginary ministers and giving orders to long-dead servants, died in July 1553 for hours, just shy of his 16th birthday. His fingers bled. He had reigned for 6 and a half turbulent years. He would continue playing even after the instrument was broken or out of tune. Sharp political crisis. He died in 1820 of the age of 81, having reigned by the bloody, successful coup of Mary I. 10 years, he had been a ghost of Edward VI, a symbol of stability who was tragically curtailed by biology. The story of George III is a painful illustration who was simply too delicate for the unforgiving political and microbial world of the 16th century. He was leaving a ruler vulnerable to political maneuvering and the cruelty of medical ignorance. The resulting political explosion shattered the peace of the kingdom.
Part 12. The Obsession with Beauty. The Tragic Isolation of Empress Elizabeth. Having basked in the bloated, high-fashion chaos of George IV's England, let's make a slightly more melancholic, beautiful, and deeply neurotic journey to the glittering, suffocating heart of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the mid-19th century. We are trading the English dandy for the Austrian icon, a woman whose life was a continuous, obsessive flight from the confines of the court. We are talking about Empress Elizabeth of Austria, 1837 to 1898, known by her affectionate nickname, Sisai. She was the Queen of Hungary, the wife of Emperor Franz Joseph I, and the undisputed fashion idol of Europe. Yet, beneath the cascade of famous chestnut hair and the tiny, corseted waistline, lay a spirit that was profoundly unhappy, neurotic, and utterly dysfunctional within the gilded cage of her royal role.
The fairy tale gone sour. Sisai's story starts like a fairy tale. She was a Bavarian princess, raised with a relatively free and informal childhood, loving nature, hunting and riding. In 1853, she traveled with her family to Bad Ischl, where her older sister was intended to be introduced to the young emperor Franz Joseph. Instead, the emperor fell instantly and utterly in love with the 16-year-old wild-spirited Sisai. The wedding was swift and magnificent. However, Sisai was completely unprepared for the suffocating rigidity of the Habsburg court, a place of endless, petty Spanish ceremony, demanding protocol, and the constant, crushing scrutiny of her formidable, traditional mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie. The protocol prison, Sisai felt instantly trapped. Every act, every outfit, every meeting was governed by centuries of strict, inflexible rules. She craved freedom, nature, and riding. The court demanded silks, silence, and endless paperwork. The mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, was the true power behind the throne, and she saw Sisai as an undisciplined, country girl unfit to be an empress. Sophie immediately took control of Sisai's first two children, removing them from their mother's care and raising them herself. This betrayal of motherhood was a psychological blow from which Sisai never truly recovered, and it cemented her desire to escape the court entirely. The obsession with physical perfection. Sisai found her way to deal with the overwhelming pressure. She turned her focus entirely inward, dedicating her life to a punishing, all-consuming cult of personal beauty and fitness. This wasn't about vanity, it was about control in a life where she had none. Her hair was her defining feature, long, thick, and famously reaching down to her ankles. Maintaining it was an astonishing, time-consuming ritual. It took 3 hours every day, often performed by her personal stylist, Fanny Fieflich. During this time, Sisai would sit reading or studying languages, sometimes having a rope hung from the ceiling so she could pull herself up to relieve the neck strain. When the stylist found a loose hair, Sisai would reportedly fly into a rage. The waistline. Sisai became obsessed with maintaining an impossibly tiny 19-inch waist. She wore extremely tight, wet leather corsets and followed agonizingly restrictive diets, often living only on consommé, milk, or freshly squeezed meat juice, the meat diet. She developed eating habits that would today be diagnosed as anorexia nervosa. The exercise regime. She exercised relentlessly. She had rings and a balance beam installed in her palace apartments and would spend hours training like an athlete. She walked for miles every day at a near-jogging pace, leaving her accompanying ladies-in-waiting exhausted and breathless. She was addicted to physical motion and constant self-punishment. The emotional and geographical flight. As her obsession with her own body grew, her interest in her husband, her children, and her duty waned. She became convinced that if she wasn't beautiful, she was worthless. And since her life at court was miserable, she simply started leaving. Sisai became the great itinerant empress. She was perpetually sick, or convinced she was sick, and would use any minor ailment as an excuse to flee the rigid court of Vienna. She spent years traveling across Europe and the Mediterranean, often alone or with a tiny, select retinue. The isolation. She saw her husband only sporadically, communicating mainly through letters that detailed her latest travels or complaints. She found genuine solace only in the company of unconventional people and in places far from the Habsburg domain, such as Hungary, where she had a much freer and more popular title as queen. The reclusiveness. As she aged, she became intensely reclusive. She forbade any further portraits or photographs, believing that physical aging was a profound weakness. She began carrying a large black leather fan in public, holding it up to shield her face from the gaze of her subjects and the press. She effectively retreated behind a physical barrier, hiding her fading beauty and her intense misery. The final tragedy. Sisai's life was punctuated by profound sadness, most notably the 1889 Mayerling incident, where her only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, and his mistress, Mary Vetzera, died in a suicide pact. This tragedy shattered Sisai. She withdrew almost entirely from public life, henceforth dressing only in black, a kind of perpetual mourning. Her final, tragic moment came in 1898. While traveling incognito in Geneva, Switzerland, she was approached by an Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchini. Lucchini, seeking notoriety by killing any royal, stabbed Sisai in the heart with a thin, sharp file. The tragedy and irony of her death were immense. The empress, who spent her life obsessed with control and escaping the duties of court protocol, was killed by a random, irrelevant act of political violence while traveling incognito, dressed down, and trying to be free. The file was so thin that she didn't realize she had been fatally wounded and walked a short distance before collapsing. Empress Elizabeth was a magnificent, complex figure who turned her profound inner unhappiness into an external obsession with perfection. Her life is a devastating picture of the emotional dysfunction that can bloom when a free spirit is forced into a golden, suffocating cage. Part 13. The Swan King and the Moon, the escapist fantasy of Ludwig II of Bavaria. Having left the deeply neurotic perfectionism of Empress Sisai, we now glide eastward, over to the romantic, mist-shrouded, and spectacularly dysfunctional court of Bavaria. Here, we find a story that is less about political failure and more about a complete, magnificent rejection of reality. We are entering the mind and the highly personalized kingdom of King Ludwig II of Bavaria, 1845 to 1886, known affectionately and accurately as the Swan King or the Fairy Tale King. His life was an exquisitely tailored opera of one, defined by a desperate desire to live in the fantastical world of medieval legends and Wagnerian mythology, while simultaneously running a modern 19th-century constitutional monarchy. It was never going to work. The problem of paternal absence. Ludwig was born with an almost absurd level of good looks and an intensely romantic, sensitive disposition. His childhood, however, was cold and isolated. The stiff upbringing. His father, King Maximilian II, was a cold, scholarly man who showed little personal affection. Ludwig was raised under a strict regimen of duty, outdoor exercise, and rigorous education, designed to squash his natural sensitivity and turn him into a proper, stoic king. It backfired spectacularly. The escape. Ludwig retreated entirely into a rich, internal world of German legends, particularly the tales of knights, swans, and ancient heroic cycles, the same tales popularized in the operas of Richard Wagner, who would become the defining figure in Ludwig's adult life. The throne arrives. Ludwig was thrust onto the throne at the age of 18 in 1864, upon the sudden death of his father. The contrast between the serious, dark-haired, devastatingly handsome young man and the dreary business of statecraft was immediate and total. The grand, ruinous obsession. Ludwig's reign was dominated by a single, expensive mission: to build his fantasy into physical reality. He utterly despised the demands of the Munich court, the noise of politics, and the vulgar intrusion of the modern world. He wanted to be a medieval sovereign, a solitary hero, not a constitutional bureaucrat. Wagner, his first great act was to become the primary patron of Richard Wagner. Ludwig was obsessed with Wagner's music and mythology, famously saving the composer from financial ruin. He poured vast amounts of money into funding Wagner's operas, especially Ring Cycle, seeing the composer as his spiritual partner in building a German artistic renaissance. This patronage infuriated the fiscally conservative Bavarian government, but Ludwig didn't care. The castles. His real passion, however, was castle building. These weren't defensive fortresses. They were extravagant, impossible monuments to escapism, designed for his own solitary contemplation. Neuschwanstein Castle, the most famous, the one Disney used as its model, was built in the Bavarian Alps. It was constructed in a romanticized medieval style, dedicated to Wagnerian heroes like the Swan Knight, Lohengrin. Ludwig lived there for only 172 days. It was a spectacular waste of money, built for an audience of one. Linderhof Palace, modeled after Versailles, but much smaller and intensely ornate. It features a fantastic Venus grotto, an artificial cave designed with a fake lake, electric lighting, a very early use of electricity, and a golden shell boat, where Ludwig would row around listening to a servant sing Wagnerian tunes. Herrenchiemsee Palace, his most ambitious folly. Built on an island, it was intended as an exact, slavish copy of the Palace of Versailles, a monument to the Sun King, Louis XIV, whom Ludwig idolized as the epitome of absolute, romantic monarchy. He managed to finish only one wing, where he would stay alone, dining off gold plates and holding court with the ghosts of the past. The twilight of isolation. As his reign continued, Ludwig became more and more isolated, retreating from the capital to his castles. The night ruler, he famously became a nocturnal creature, working and traveling mostly at night, viewing the world only by the light of the moon and torches. He disliked bright, modern daylight and the common people. He used special gilded sledges and carriages to travel through the moonlit Alps, often with a solitary, accompanying servant. The public debt. By the 1880s, Ludwig's private debts from his building projects were catastrophic, reaching millions of marks, and he refused to use state funds, insisting he was paying for them out of his own pocket, which, by this point, was impossible. His ministers, facing financial ruin for the royal house, desperately tried to intervene. The incompetence. Politically, Ludwig was a liability. He refused to meet with his ministers, preferring to communicate through lengthy, demanding letters sent from his secluded castles. The business of government stalled. He was a king who was structurally refusing to perform his job. The final mystery. In 1886, a consortium of his exasperated cabinet ministers, using medical reports from 4 psychiatrists who had never actually examined the king, declared Ludwig too legally insane and incapable of ruling. They sent a commission to Neuschwanstein to depose him. Ludwig, initially resistant, was eventually taken into custody and transported to Berg Castle on the shore of Lake Starnberg. The final act of his bizarre life occurred just 2 days later. On the evening of June 13, 1886, Ludwig went for a walk with the lead psychiatrist of the commission, Dr. Bernhard von Gudden. They never returned alive. Their bodies were found hours later, floating in the shallow water near the shore of the lake. The circumstances were immediately mysterious and remain so today. Accident or suicide? The official ruling was suicide by drowning. The oddities: Ludwig was a strong swimmer, and the water was only knee-deep where the bodies were found. Dr. von Gudden's body showed signs of a struggle. Did Ludwig try to escape, and the doctor intervened? Was it a double murder? Was the king strangled before entering the water? No one knows for certain. The government quickly hushed up the details and installed his uncle as regent. The death of Ludwig II was a spectacular, tragic end to a life that was one long, desperate attempt to reject the present. He was a king who simply preferred the lonely, perfect world of his own imagination to the messy, complicated reality of ruling. Part 14. The Hemophiliac Web. When Queen Victoria's genes went global. We have just witnessed the dramatic, waterlogged end of the Swan King. Let's take a pivot now, moving from the singular artistic dysfunction of a lonely king to the sweeping, disastrous medical and emotional legacy of a massive royal family, the descendants of Queen Victoria. If the Spanish Habsburgs taught us about the dangers of extreme inbreeding, the Victorian era taught us how a single, specific, and very famous genetic mutation can spread silently through an entire continent's royalty, thanks to a few carefully placed marriages. We are, of course, talking about the prevalence of hemophilia in the royal houses of Europe, a tragedy that affected the lives and, in some cases, the fate of several major monarchies. The source: Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria, 1819 to 1901. Herself was the carrier of the X-linked recessive gene for hemophilia B, often called the royal disease. Hemophilia prevents blood from clotting properly, making simple injuries potentially fatal and turning internal bleeding, especially into joints, into a source of constant pain and debilitating disease. The irony here is delicious in a dark, historical way. Queen Victoria was the ultimate symbol of British stability, morality, and bourgeois family values. Yet, unknowingly, she carried a genetic time bomb that she happily, and very successfully, exported across Europe. She was called the grandmother of Europe because she had 9 children, and through their strategic marriages, those children married into virtually every major royal house. The spreading: this meant that the hemophilia gene spread quickly into the ruling houses of Spain, Prussia, Germany, and Russia. The disease almost exclusively affects males, with females being carriers, like Victoria herself, who show few or no symptoms. The anxiety and tragedy that followed these marriages were immense. The tragedy in Spain. One of the most severely affected branches was the Spanish royal family, who, of course, had just finished dealing with the genetic fallout of Charles II. Because why stop at one genetic problem when you can inherit another? Queen Victoria Eugenia, Victoria's granddaughter, Princess Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, Ana, married King Alfonso XIII of Spain in 1906. She was a carrier. The heir's disease, their eldest son and heir, Prince Alfonso, was born with hemophilia. The king blamed Ana and reportedly grew cold and emotionally distant from her for the rest of their marriage. The knowledge that the future king could bleed to death from a simple fall or a minor cut cast a permanent shadow of dread over the Spanish court. Prince Alfonso led a tragically restricted life, and later renounced his rights to the throne. The catastrophe in Russia. The most historically significant transmission of the gene was into the Russian imperial house of the Romanovs. Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna, Queen Victoria's granddaughter, Princess Alex of Hesse and by Rhine, later Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna, married Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. She was also a carrier. Tsarevich Alexei, they had 4 healthy daughters, but the birth of the long-awaited heir, Tsarevich Alexei, in 1904, brought the full horror of the disease to the Russian throne. Alexei had severe hemophilia. The constant medical crises, the unpredictable, agonizing joint bleeds, and the near-fatal episodes turned the entire Romanov family dynamic inward. The rise of Rasputin. The court doctors were useless, unable to stop Alexei's relentless internal bleeding. The only person who seemed consistently able to comfort the boy and occasionally stop the bleeding was the controversial Siberian mystic, Grigory Rasputin. The desperate, frantic love of the parents for their sickly son allowed Rasputin to gain an almost unbelievably destructive level of influence over the empress, and through her, over the political decisions of the Tsar. The hemophilia gene, carried quietly from Queen Victoria, was therefore a direct, structural contributor to the fall of the Romanov dynasty. The chaos and scandal surrounding Rasputin, all centered around saving the life of the heir, discredited the monarchy among the Russian elite and the public, weakening the Tsar's position just as the storm of the Russian Revolution was gathering force. It's a sobering example of how a microscopic biological error can trigger macro-historical events. The emotional dysfunction. Beyond the political consequences, the disease created immense personal dysfunction within the families themselves. Constant anxiety. Carriers, like Empress Alexandra, lived in a state of perpetual, debilitating anxiety, constantly watching for bruises, cuts, or signs of an internal bleed in their sons. This stress often led to obsessive, withdrawn, and even hysterical behavior. Seclusion. The hemophiliac princes often lived secluded lives, kept away from normal boyhood activities, running, roughhousing, or any sport that could trigger a fatal bleed. This meant they grew up isolated, unprepared, and profoundly sad, trapped by the fragility of their own blood. The legacy of the royal disease is one of vast, interdynastic anxiety. It's a quiet tragedy of constant suffering, political vulnerability, and the sad irony that these carefully chosen, high-value marriages, meant to consolidate power, were actually carrying a hidden flaw that helped, in part, to eventually destroy it. We've now connected the dots from a Victorian grandmother to the fall of the Tsars. This quiet, persistent strain of genetic weakness underscores the ultimate historical dysfunction, the simple failure of biology. Part 15. The Unfit Emperor, the Childish Chaos of Peter III of Russia. We are making our final, sleepy transition, sailing back to the frigid and fiercely dramatic court of Russia, but jumping back in time. We are settling on the brief, utterly baffling reign of a man who serves as the ultimate historical example of being completely and spectacularly unfit for the job he was born to do. Tsar Peter III, 1728 to 1762. Peter III's life is a fascinating, if short, study in historical mismatch. He was a German princeling, forced into the role of Russian emperor, who hated everything about Russia, loved everything about the Prussian military, and seemed to have the emotional maturity of an aggressive 12-year-old boy. The Prussian prince in a Russian court. Peter was born Karl Peter Ulrich to the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp. His mother was the daughter of Peter the Great, making him a legitimate heir to the Russian throne. He was orphaned young and raised in the minor German court of Holstein, where he was educated with the sole purpose of becoming a Prussian military officer. He absolutely worshipped Frederick the Great of Prussia. The call to Russia. In 1742, he was summoned to Russia by his aunt, Empress Elizabeth, the daughter of Peter the Great. He was declared the official heir and told to convert to Orthodoxy and prepare for his destiny. The cultural misfit, Peter was miserable. He disliked the Russian people, despised the Orthodox Church, and refused to even try to understand Russian customs or politics. He never mastered the Russian language, speaking it poorly for the rest of his life. He felt trapped and humiliated, constantly pining for his native Germany and his beloved Prussian military regiment. The hobbyist. As an adult, Peter's primary passion was playing with toy soldiers. He would spend hours drilling his servants in full uniform and holding military trials for rats that had the audacity to chew on his lead soldiers. Accounts describe him meticulously staging vast, complex battles in his private chambers, a truly bizarre sight for the heir to the Russian Empire. The awful marriage. His marriage was no better. He was married to the sharp, intelligent, and fiercely ambitious German princess Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, who would become known to history as Catherine the Great. It was a marriage of mutual repulsion. Peter was emotionally abusive, physically unattractive, and entirely absorbed in his childish games. Catherine was horrified by his boorishness and his immaturity, and she had no intention of sinking with his ship of dysfunction. The bedroom farce. The marriage went famously unconsummated for years. When they finally had a son, Paul, the same Paul the first we discussed in Part 7, it's widely believed that Peter was not the father, a detail that was quietly accepted by the court as a matter of dynastic necessity. Peter was simply too occupied with his toys and his mistress, Elizaveta Vorontsova, who was notoriously ugly and boisterous, a choice which mystified everyone at court. The constant taunting. Peter would openly mock and humiliate Catherine, often in front of the entire court. He treated her as an irrelevant, slightly annoying relative. While Peter was focused on playing war, Catherine was focused on studying Russia, mastering the language, charming the Orthodox clergy, cultivating powerful friends in the military, and generally positioning herself as the viable Russian alternative to her disastrous German husband. The 6-month disaster. In January 1762, Empress Elizabeth died, and Peter finally ascended the throne, launching one of the shortest, strangest reigns in Russian history, a mere 186 days. His first acts were to implement his long-held, immature fantasies. The Prussian pivot. Despite the fact that Russia was winning the 7 Years' War against Prussia and had Prussian forces on the ropes, Peter instantly withdrew Russian troops and made a separate, incredibly generous peace treaty with his hero, Frederick the Great. He essentially gave back all the conquered territory and even offered to send Russian troops to help Frederick. This was seen by the Russian army as an ultimate act of betrayal and national humiliation. The uniform obsession. He forced the Russian Guard to immediately adopt the stiff, formal, utterly impractical Prussian military uniforms. This was the final insult to the elite Russian officers who had fought and bled in their traditional uniforms. The insults. He continued to insult the Russian Orthodox Church, threatening to secularize church lands and even ordering the removal of revered religious icons from public spaces. He was essentially poking every single powerful, sensitive Russian institution with a very sharp, Prussian stick. The inevitable coup. Peter III was an emperor for less than a year, but he alienated every single power base necessary for survival: the military, the Orthodox Church, and his wife. He was so deeply consumed by his personal obsessions, his toy soldiers, his mistress, and his devotion to Prussia, that he failed to see the danger gathering right under his nose. He had made vague threats to divorce Catherine, have her arrested, and marry his mistress, Elizaveta. This gave Catherine the perfect and urgent reason to act. In June 1762, while Peter was away from the capital playing war games, Catherine, relying on her network of loyal military officers, especially the Orloff brothers, executed a brilliant, bloodless coup. She rode to the barracks, where the guards swore instant allegiance to her, recognizing her as the superior, more Russian ruler. Peter, stunned and pathetic, abdicated almost immediately. He offered no resistance, simply signing the abdication papers, reportedly asking only for a violin, his dog, his mistress, and a pet monkey. He was imprisoned in a small estate called Rapsha. A week later, he was murdered by his guards, likely at the indirect command of Catherine or her circle. He was simply too dangerous to be left alive. His death was officially announced as a fatal case of hemorrhoidal colic. Because, hemorrhoids can be deadly when you're unpopular. The brief, farcical, and tragic reign of Peter III ended with the triumphant ascension of his wife, Catherine II, a woman who proved that political cunning and competence, even acquired through the most dramatic means, will always trump genetic legitimacy when the king is busy playing with tin men. And on that final, chaotic note of Prussian uniforms, toy soldiers, and fatal hemorrhoids, we bring our long, sleepy historical monologue on dysfunctional royalty to a close. I hope this deep dive into the messiness of history has been the perfect gentle distraction. I hope you enjoyed this long, comprehensive journey through historical muck and royal dysfunction.